more broadly about DNA, genetics, and more importantly, maybe your own DNA and what happens to it. So you guys have a list of bios, so I'm not going to read through those, but what we're going to do is we're going to have Heather start off to talk to you about the actual project, and then sort of move down sort of to have a larger discussion where I believe Sonia is going to go, Professor Sonia Sutter is going to go second, and then Nancy Kelly is going to follow her, and then Eleanor and I are going to try to lead a discussion amongst the panelists and as well as the audience. So come up with some interesting questions because we'd like this to be a broad discussion with everyone here. Did I reverse those? Okay, Nancy's going to go after Heather, so we'll figure that out as we go along. So I'll turn it over to Heather and let her describe the work she's been doing.
Sure. Okay. Thank you all for coming. Can you hear me, or
Just
should
put
I
that
pull this closer?
we are webcasting this, so when we have questions, everyone needs to use their microphone.
Okay. So, does that work? Okay. Hi, I'm Heather Dewey-Hagborg, and I'm going to be talking about Stranger Visions, which is a work-in-progress art piece that I've been working on for the past year and a half. And so, you probably noticed this face as you were coming into the room today, and here it is, writ large behind us. So this is a face of a stranger. This is a person who I've never met, but whose DNA I've extracted and analyzed. I found the cigarette butt from which I extracted his DNA on the sidewalk near my apartment in Brooklyn. By extracting the DNA from this cigarette butt in the lab and analyzing it, I've discovered so far that it's a male, that he's Eastern European, and that he has brown eyes. More recently, I've also discovered that he has an average tendency towards obesity and a slightly larger than average nose. So there's a lot more that I actually hope to discover about this man as I continue with my lab work. This is a preliminary in-progress portrait. So it represents only a small handful of traits relating to facial appearance compared to the number that I can find out given enough time and money. So as I continue to work in the lab, I plan to analyze more details of his ancestry, his skin complexion, such as whether he has lighter or darker skin, whether he has freckles, his hair color, other dimensions of his face as well, such as things like whether his eyes tend to be closer together or further apart. And I'm going to introduce you to a few of the other portraits that I'm working on right now as well. This is a female of European descent from another cigarette butt that I found in my neighborhood. The project here is called Stranger Visions, and in it I'm creating these portrait sculptures, 3D portrait sculptures from analyses of genetic material that I collect in public places. Working with traces that strangers unwittingly leave behind, I'm attempting to call attention to a potential for a culture of genetic surveillance. This is another male, also from my neighborhood in Bushwick. And he's of South American or Native American descent, likely Latino. And the last in this series of current in-progress portraits is a male of West African descent. And this is a sample I found on Flatbush Avenue in downtown Brooklyn, right near GenSpace, which is a DIY community biolab that I work in. So there's been some confusion in the media, I think, over what this project is and what it isn't. So I just want to lay out briefly what it isn't and what it is. So it isn't a new scientific discovery discussing how to reconstruct faces from DNA. It's not that. It's not some dazzling new technology or a startup. The piece is meant as a provocation in the spirit of tactical media. It's supposed to make you think about privacy, about genetics, and about the biotechnological future. So the point isn't that I can know everything about a person from a piece of chewing gum, rather that I, as an amateur, can know as much as I do, and potentially can know a whole lot more. So in my art, I use a research-based approach to working on art, and I generally start with a question. In this case, the question that came to me was, how much can I learn about someone from a hair? And a lot of this relates to my background in machine learning or artificial intelligence. I've spent a lot of time working at the intersection of art and AI, really thinking deeply about machine learning algorithms and about the traces of the human hand that remain in the algorithm and the way that the human programmer influences a statistical system. And I've also been thinking a lot about privacy online, right? Data, privacy online, surveillance on the street, things like facial recognition, speech recognition, and dealing with those algorithms from an artistic perspective. So this was kind of a natural direction for me, coming from thinking about data privacy to starting to think about our genetic data privacy. So when I started thinking about this question of what could I know about someone from a hair that they just accidentally dropped on the bench in a subway, I started seeing this data, seeing this forensic evidence everywhere, from bathrooms to sidewalks to bars to the subway. And I was really struck by this idea that the very things that make us human, hair and skin and saliva and fingernails, all this messy stuff, that these things become a real liability for us as we constantly face this possibility of shedding them in public and leaving these traces which anyone could come along and mine for information. And so what I thought about, as I was starting to think about these ideas and starting to sort of shape them into an artistic project, I was thinking about a way to visualize this in a visceral way, something that you'd walk up to and have a real gut reaction to. And that's sort of how I came to thinking about this sculptural portrait as a representation that was very literal. So I'm going to show you, this is a video that describes the process that I go through. And so I'm going to play the video and sort of narrate it a little bit. Can you guys see it okay? You'll see me, so basically what I'm doing here, describing kind of the technical process of the piece. So I'm just going about my daily routines, you know, going from place to place in Brooklyn, going into Manhattan perhaps. And if I see something that looks promising, I pick it up. So the kinds of samples that tend to be good are very fresh. They're things like, you know, a cigarette butt that's recently been deposited on the sidewalk, or, you know, hair that doesn't look like it's sort of been sitting in the corner for too long. Basically, the longer something sits around, the more the DNA degrades. So I try to find samples that are as fresh as possible. And so this is GenSpace. This is one of the labs that I work in. This is in downtown Brooklyn. And I bring the hair or the cigarette butt, the chewing gum, whatever it is, to the lab. And usually take the sample and cut it into little tiny pieces. Just usually take a little chunk out of it. If you look at the sample box here, you'll see that the cigarette butt has this little square that's been cut out of it. So I take that little square and then I cut that into smaller pieces. And then it's kind of this process of just adding the right chemicals at the right times, shaking it up, incubating it, centrifuging it, and sort of going through this process several times until a pure DNA is isolated from that sample. And then what I do is I use a technique called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, and I use this to target the specific traits that I'm interested in. So I have this master list of 50 different traits that are generally correlations between some feature and some SNP, or single nucleotide polymorphism, some base pair in the DNA that has been associated with this trait. So I run these PCR reactions to look for these specific traits and often send them out for sequencing to determine whether this person has this variant of the trait or this variant, A or B. So with the in-progress portraits that I've mentioned so far, I've only gotten to the point so far where I can analyze 5 of these traits in the lab myself. If I were to send the sample out for sequencing, for example, to a company like 23andMe, who do the personal genomic profiling, then I could access all of those 50 traits that I'm interested in. But they don't accept forensic samples. So I take the traits, and maybe I'll just pause this for a second. So after running these various PCR reactions and accumulating as many traits as I can about the individual, I feed these into software that I've been working on, it's not special. It's just a variation on other kinds of software that are available. I just customized it for my own purposes. And what the software does is it takes a 3D model of a face and morphs it to look like the various traits that I'm feeding in. So it'll morph it along axes of gender and ethnicity and weight, and it can also do age, although I don't know age yet for the samples. And then I add other traits by hand. So I'll add eye color, I'll paint by hand, freckles, I'll paint by hand, things of that nature. And then I take this 3D model that I've output, and usually I generate 5 different versions of a given face, and then I choose the version of it that I think is the most compelling artistically. And I send it to a 3D printer. Printing process occurring here. This is a really test print of a miniature. And this is one of the faces coming out of the printer. And then it is infiltrated with a kind of super glue-like substance which strengthens the material. And then they're exhibited both online on my website and in various physical gallery and non-traditional spaces such as the hallway at the Wilson Center. So this gives you some idea, I hope, of the technological side of it as well as a little bit of the aesthetic side of it, although we can talk about both more. But the real reason we're here, right, is to talk about the implications of what it means for me to do this, what it means for potentially other companies, law enforcement to do this. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about how I've seen the implications just from the research I've been doing in working on the piece. And so really working on this project has primarily raised questions for me. Questions like, what are the implications for personal privacy if governments, corporations, or even private individuals like me can read our DNA? And how will it affect the political and social interpretation of law enforcement if police analyze a hair from a crime scene and discover that someone is likely to be of a certain ethnic background? How might this have affected the reaction to the recent Boston bombing, for example? So one concern I have is that this technology will simply reinforce cultural stereotypes that are already so problematic and potentially become a new form of racial profiling. So this is interesting. In doing my research for this project, I came across this issue had already come up in the Netherlands, and I actually came across it originally because I was applying to do this project at an organization in the Netherlands and to actually collaborate with the forensic, police type of organization that they have there. And they said, we can't do this. And the reason they can't do it is because they've actually regulated this technology already. So as I was researching this, I came across this article in Science describing the story of a young woman who is brutally raped and murdered, and after a year the police still have no suspects. And I guess she came from a rural community, and people there were beginning to point fingers at the local Middle Eastern population. And at that point in time, as I understand it, this type of genetic profiling was considered illegal in the Netherlands. But a forensic biologist working on the case decided to go ahead and analyze the sample anyway. And it showed that the semen sample that was left at the crime scene was from an individual of European descent. And so in this particular instance, interestingly, this result actually helped calm the tensions that were brewing in this community. But you have to wonder what would happen if it had been the opposite result and what kind of reaction that might have engendered. What else is interesting about that case is that it's reported differently depending on what news you read. There's several different reports about this type of work, Forensic DNA Phenotyping, about that in the Netherlands, and I've actually read contradictory reports about its legality or regulation. But as best as I could figure out with my resources, it seemed that the Dutch passed a law regulating the practice of forensic DNA phenotyping, so taking it from being illegal to being regulated. And so the law that they arrived at allows phenotyping for physical visible characteristics like eye color and ethnicity, but prevents analyzing evidence for things like disease risk. And I think the logic here is both that DNA can show us what a witness might tell us, as well as it preventing the accidental disclosure of personal information. So, I think it's important to learn from the history of similar technologies here. So part of the research I've been doing, I should say also that I'm working on a PhD right now, and so I'm really digging into a lot of the historical, historical information, historical things that have occurred that are similar to this. So looking at DNA typing or profiling, for example, which had a really long battle in the courts, went through a lot of legal back and forth, the so-called DNA wars. And in the end, it does seem that that process actually resulted in a more accurate technology, that kind of debate that happened publicly may have been for the best. And so I think it would be better, since we're in the infancy of thinking about this kind of forensic DNA phenotyping technologies and genetic surveillance, that we try to implement them in ways that proceed more cautiously and judiciously than we did with DNA profiling, to hopefully avoid some of the issues that we know are going to be problematic, such as thinking about statistics, right? So with DNA typing, there was a lot of debate over how to calculate statistics, and actually, it hasn't been totally resolved. Questions about contamination, the calculation of error rates, formalizing protocols, and thinking about also what the limitations of the technology are, and being cautious about pushing it beyond those boundaries. So in my understanding, and I'll be interested to hear what other people know about this, but in my understanding, this type of forensic phenotyping is unregulated at the federal level, but a few states have prohibited it explicitly: Indiana, Rhode Island, and Wyoming. This is what I've come across so far. And I think it's important to remember here that DNA databases nationwide are expanding. We just heard in the news this morning, right, about making it, or affirming the legality of taking DNA samples from people who haven't even been convicted yet, right? People who are just suspects. And also we've seen nationwide increasingly people who are convicted of just misdemeanors being expected to donate DNA to the database, which is important, right? Because the database is what we draw on when we look for cold hits and things of that nature. So the database creates a population that then can be called upon to be seen as criminals. And it's important to think about how that database is constructed. Also, in the past year, a kit called H-IRIS-Plex was released, which allows police to tell a suspect's eye and hair color. Of course, this is skewed towards a European population because that's what the data was derived from. And then there's also a company called Sorensen Forensics that allows the police to send forensic samples for ethnicity typing. So it's here. This is happening now. You know, it's not in the future. It's something that's being worked on currently. The stuff that I'm doing is pretty much already happening. And so it's really a question of how we proceed with it. And just to sort of conclude this portion of the presentation, I want to stress that forensic phenotyping isn't like DNA typing, right? It's not like looking at someone's DNA fingerprint. That has its own set of problems, but is a lot more accurate than this type of technology, which is really probabilistic and based on statistical studies. So there's a chance of a certain strength that I can tell something about what you look like from your DNA, but I also could be wrong. The image that you see on this slide is my global similarity chart from my 23andMe personal genomic profile. And so I could look all kinds of ways, right? I mean, if you look at these columns, I could look all kinds of ways from this chart. So I would just stress that the science behind this technology is probabilistic. And the problem with that is that comparing it to, for example, what a witness might say, DNA technology has this aura of objectivity coming from science. You know, it's written in our DNA. And so that gives it a different kind of interpretation than what an eyewitness would, which I think we need to be cautious about. So I'm just going to conclude with a few kind of prompts based on my thoughts on this and pass it on. So first of all, this is the most obvious question, I think, raised by the piece, and it's highly related also to issues of patenting genes. Who owns your genetic material? Do you own your genetic material? Do I have a right to go out and collect these anonymous samples and analyze them? It's one question. And do you have a right to genetic privacy? Do you have a right not to know certain things about yourself and not to have others know certain things about you? And then with forensic phenotyping, the same issue recurs here, right? Do you have a right not to know potentially upsetting things about yourself that might come out through the creation of a police sketch based on DNA, which might be broadcast publicly, might become associated with you if you're a suspect? So how might this limit forensic DNA phenotyping if we do have this kind of right? And then one of the problems which I raised, which I think is one of the most concerning to me, stigmatization, discrimination, and ethnic profiling. So how might DNA phenotyping lead to a new form of racial profiling? You know, something we've seen is already so problematic, escalate tensions, and how could we avoid this? Well, not explicitly prohibiting a new technology that could be really beneficial, right? It can provide a lot of insightful information. And then finally, I think the programmer in me says we really need to think about accuracy issues and bias, right? The people who are designing these systems have a lot of impact on how they end up playing out and the kinds of inductive biases that they have. So how can we be aware of these accuracy and bias issues?
All right, thanks a lot. That's been very thought-provoking. I'm going to turn it over to Nancy Kelly, who's the founding executive director of the New York Genome Center.
Thank you. That was really, really great discussion. And I think that's what really is interesting about this panel in general is that not whether the faces actually look like the people or the portraits actually look like the people who are mostly anonymous, but it's really about the questions that are raised by this exhibit, many of which Heather just described, and the social and ethical implications of genetic surveillance. As Heather said, we're leaving DNA samples everywhere. We're shedding hair constantly, shedding skin, you know, throwing down butts. So there's a DNA trail of ours in the wake of our passing wherever we go. And basically, you know, DNA is base pairs of a sequence of nucleic acid, and it's generally represented by 4 letters, A, G, B, and T. It's like the 1 and 0 when you're digitizing information, right? Which raises the question is this just a protein language, or is it something that is really of essence that makes us up, even though the arrangement of those letters is unique? So each person's DNA is unique and contains information, as Heather's alluded to, about heritage, appearance, but also about predisposition to disease, which is something you may or may not want to know. It's something that you may or may not want your insurance company or your family members to know. And so really the key question to me, the first one is, and the property question comes next, does one have a right of privacy in the genetic information contained in your DNA? And the reason this is important is because the right of privacy implies the right to control personal information about yourself. It also includes notion of being able to remain anonymous if you wish, and restriction on physical access to information about yourself. And so when a right of privacy is called into question, care must be taken to protect that information unless consent is given to disclose it. That's the principle. And I think that when you're talking about predisposition to disease or medical information, it's a much easier question, right? because there's a strong expectation of privacy that's protected by state and federal law in your medical records. And the laws protect against the dissemination without consent of your genetic information. But does the same right of privacy or expectation of privacy exist with respect to genetic information related to your appearance? Because your appearance doesn't remain private the moment you step out in public, right? Somebody can take a picture of you on the subway. Is this just like that? Is it analogous to the laws regarding the commercial use of one's likeness, where you do need approval in order for someone to use your image? And if so, where must the consent be obtained? Would a person have recourse, for example, against Heather if they walked by and noticed their face in her exhibit, right? Just totally anonymous person. Interesting question. Another question is, obviously, this is mostly about property. What about DNA discarded, either intentionally, when you throw a butt down on a street or a piece of gum, or unintentionally just through normal biological processes like shedding hair? Now you're entering a gray area of property law, because when property that belongs to you is intentionally thrown away or unintentionally discarded and left behind, it belongs to whoever picks it up and finds it. So then you're confronted with the idea, is DNA property? And if it is it something that is so unique about our essence, our individual essence of being unique human beings, that we need to kind of construct a separate class of property that's in nature so unique that it should be governed by a different set of rules. And here's where the law really has to step in to determine what those rules will be, because most jurisdictions are silent on abandoned or lost DNA right now. And so DNA is either lost or trash, but it is also contains important medical information. I think this is where the hook comes in for regulators to start thinking about this. Because there is a distinction between, I think, just abandoned DNA, like in a piece of gum, and DNA with a legitimate right to privacy. And so perhaps the difference lies in the objects with which the DNA lies embedded versus the actual information of the DNA code itself. So there's no right to privacy in the gum, there's no right to privacy in your cigarette butt, but there is right to privacy in the code that contains information about yourself, which you may not even want to know, right? And so it's kind of the whole spit versus code argument right there. And if then you get to the next question, it's kind of a cascading effect of questions and regulatory issues. So if the DNA is a special form of privacy, does sequencing someone's genome by a third party without consent constitute theft? And if so, is it a felony? And then what's the punishment for that, right? And in 2006, the United Kingdom was actually the first country to pass a law making it illegal for private citizens to sequence someone else's DNA without their consent. And I think thinking about this, just think about in the election campaign for Ronald Reagan, if somebody had picked up one of his hairs and had it sequenced and found out that he had the ApoE gene for Alzheimer's. You know, how would that have changed the history of the world? Honestly, when you think about that, these are really important questions about whether somebody can sequence someone else's DNA without their consent. And then what should be the role of using DNA in law enforcement? So that raises, as Heather alluded to, issues of accuracy, abuse, discrimination, and I came up with a fact this morning about the registry of DNA, which I thought was quite astonishing. Let me see if I can find it here in my notes. So the National DNA Database, which is the largest database right now, contains 5 million profiles. And the information in that, as Heather said, is collected when someone is basically charged with a recordable offense. And a recordable offense includes offenses that could lead to 1 year's imprisonment, as well as other minor offenses like begging or being drunk in a public place. It applies to both children and adults. And the law was changed in 2001 to allow the DNA to be kept indefinitely, which means that since you're only charged and not convicted, a lot of innocent people's DNA is in that registry, right? Well, it turns out that the DNA database is highly discriminatory because 1/2 to 3/4 of all young black men have their DNA stored based on the higher arrest rate for young black males in this country. Now, it's interesting that the arrest rate is higher, but the conviction rate isn't. So that's where the discriminatory effect comes in. And it really does have a disproportionate effect on your own private interests when you're innocent and your DNA is stored indefinitely in some public database. And so, since the right to privacy is not an absolute right, there are exceptions made for law enforcement, for national security. It's basically balancing state interests against individual interests. What are the exceptions that will protect a person's individual right of privacy while allowing the state to protect itself and others? And these, I think, are some of the really important, intriguing questions that this exhibit raises. And I just congratulate you because this is exactly the kind of public dialogue we need, that we were trying to get started at the New York Genome Center with our blogs and the information that we were presenting there, because the public needs to be able to know about this. Thank you.
Thank Nancy. That was really fascinating. So now we're going to turn to Professor Suter from the George Washington University Law School, who's going to answer all these legal questions for us.
Well, I was going to ask a lot of questions myself and talk a little bit about the state of the law and also the ethical issues. I teach a course called Genetics and Law, and it's as much about ethics and policy as it is about law, because the truth is, in many areas, we don't really have a lot of law. And so the questions are often, what should the laws be? How should we describe them? So first, I want to thank you for inviting me. This is such an interesting topic. I've been so excited about this meeting today. And I know Heather had hoped, I heard or read in some of the press that she was interested in her work serving as social commentary and provoking discussion, and I think it really does that. So I want to talk about the ethical and legal implications, both in what Heather's actually doing, but also what her work suggests could be done. Right, so I'm going to be sort of going back and forth as I think about this. I wanted to just take a brief moment to talk about what we mean by privacy. This is a term that's used in many, many different ways, and I think everybody has sort of a sense of what they mean by privacy. And in this context, I think we're really talking about the right to control access to information. In the genetics world, when we talk about genetics privacy, we're usually talking about controlling access to information. And as Nancy pointed out, it's not just who gets your information, but also what information one receives about themselves. I was a genetic counselor, and a big part of genetic counseling was helping people decide whether they wanted certain information or not. But there are other aspects of privacy too. There's the right to control what happens with things about you. So even if something isn't connected to you or known to be connected to you, you might still have an interest in deciding how this is used. And I'll come back to that a bit later. So it's not just about what people know about me, Sonia Suter, but it's also about what things are connected to me that people don't know are connected to me. Can I control access and uses of that? So genetic privacy's gotten a lot of attention in the last few decades. It's personal information, it's intimate, it's all about us, right? And I think one thing to think about, and you've hinted at this, Heather, is to avoid too much of a view that genetics determines everything about us. Now, it's important because it tells us a lot about who we are and who we're going to become. It determines our sex, it determines much about our appearance, about our health, about temperament. But of course, our environment also plays an enormous role, and there are complex interactions, which is why it's probably impossible, even as the technology improves, to pick up a piece of DNA and create a perfect representation of what a person looks like. Because Heather doesn't have in that gum information about the environmental exposures and all the elements that work together with genes to determine information. Also, I think there's a tendency to think all genetic information is highly sensitive, but of course there's a range of genetic information. Some of it's not particularly sensitive or private. Information about my sex, that's not hidden. My eye color. Now, somebody's hair color, that might be a little more hidden. It's not always known. That may be more secret. But of course, as Nancy talked about, there is personal information in our DNA, and it's the information about predisposition to diseases that's so sensitive, information that we may not want to know, and information about behavioral traits. And of course, one of the biggest reasons people worry about genetic privacy are the risks of its stigmatizing effect. And so we've had a lot of legislation at the state level, and then finally, after 13 years, at the federal level to try to deal with genetic discrimination, worries that insurers, employers, and now it's expanded to other categories of concern, what kind of insurers, schools, there's worries about discrimination. There may not have been actually as much discrimination as people believe, but there's always that potential, and people are afraid of the discrimination, and that affects their behavior. Genetic information can also reveal a great deal about family members, and so it's sensitive in that way, and that has important implications in the criminal profiling context as well. So these are all reasons why we care about genetic privacy. So what does this all mean with respect to Heather's work? I think that the actual work she's doing right now asks us to think about whether we're concerned about the collection of DNA that's analyzed to describe features of people who are unknown and who have deposited their material. And that really gets to a few different kinds of questions. It raises questions about whether we think consent should always be important for any kind of genetic analysis. Now, I'm for a moment leaving aside the analysis for convicted criminals. I disagree with the view about arrestees, but I'm not on the Supreme Court. But a newborn screening. But just in an ordinary situation, does it matter what the DNA analysis is? Second question is, does it matter if we're taking the sample and we're analyzing it from somebody who's anonymous to us, who's unidentified? Does that change the privacy equation? And then, does it matter if the material's been abandoned? So they're intersected, but I want to sort of separate these out. So the consent part, as Nancy pointed out, privacy protections, a lot of legislative privacy protections use consent to do a lot of the work of protecting the information, so that you must consent to access to the information, or you must consent to the dissemination of the information. So what Heather's actually doing, people might say, well, there aren't really a lot of privacy implications here, because she's trying to get genetic information about visible traits, about things that we would see if the person were walking on the street. Now, it's not a perfect likeness because there's probabilities and the environmental influences, but as Nancy says, maybe a lot like taking a picture of somebody on the subway or on the street, and there aren't privacy protections against that. Although there is the appropriation part. If you then take it and you can make money off of the portrait, then there might be privacy issues. But what's different here is that it's not just what Heather's doing, but it's what she could potentially do once she's obtained this DNA. Right? She could take it and she could analyze it for much more information. So what if Heather decided that she didn't want to just do a portrait of a face, but she also wanted to show something more about the person, maybe represent the predisposition to heart disease or the increased risk of colon cancer, so somehow in the portrait to convey this information, right? She could get a lot more information. Now, she's not doing that, but she could easily do that once she has the information, and it's only going to get easier over time. So she's really, I think, forcing us to confront where we are with technology and how things are only going to become easier. In a way, she gets to the issue of surreptitious sampling, surreptitious DNA testing. That's been going on actually for a while now. So people have done it for paternity testing. People have done it to see if their partners are having affairs. People have the police have used it for DNA identification. Now that's, as Heather pointed out, that's looking for identifying information, the DNA fingerprinting. And we might say that looks sort of different because you're looking at regions of the DNA that aren't coding for diseases. It's in the, quote, junk DNA, although I think we're going to discover that there's a lot more in that junk than we think. But it shows the possibility, it shows how this is already becoming part of our culture. Now with the proliferation of direct-to-consumer companies that do medical genetic analysis, it opens up the possibility not only for getting information about a phenotype, but to discover what people look like in the way that's shown to the world, but also about the more hidden information. Now, I'm glad to see that 23andMe isn't willing to do a lot of this, but it's hard sometimes. Maybe they don't want to do forensic samples, but it's hard to control. They say they want you to have legal authority, but it's hard to know if the sample came from the person who's requesting it or not. So I think it really highlights the fact that we're at a time now where it's just going to be easier and easier for somebody walking down the street to get a great deal of information about us. And so Gattaca, here we come. When, I forget the character's name, but when Uma Thurman gets Ethan Hawke's hair and walks to a little kiosk and suddenly learns all this information. So there are genetic privacy statutes, although I think that, Nancy, maybe you overstate how much the laws actually protect medical privacy. There are really limits in how much our medical information is protected. A lot of the privacy laws protect information when it's in the hands of certain parties, like HIPAA. The privacy rule really regulates behavior of healthcare plans, healthcare providers, healthcare clearinghouses, but not the ordinary citizen. There are really only genetic privacy laws in about half of the states. So we have limited protections right now. And even what Heather's doing, it's, I think, a good question. Can she do what she's doing in different states? I think it's, in many states, I think she can do what she's doing. The definition of genetic information is narrow in a lot of these jurisdictions. The definition is sometimes just about information related to disease. So that wouldn't include identification of information about traits and ancestry. She also is getting information about, the laws also are sometimes limited to insurers, employers, or doctors, and so aren't applying to the ordinary citizen. They're probably only about 10 to 20, it's sort of hard to understand what the laws are always getting at, but probably only about 10 to 20 laws that actually prohibit the unconsented genetic analysis by an ordinary citizen. So in most jurisdictions, you're probably okay. I'm not sure about New York. I have to check that a little more closely. So some people have talked about the surreptitious collection of DNA as genetic stalking. And in only a few jurisdictions is it actually a criminal offense. And in those jurisdictions, it's really just a misdemeanor. In the other jurisdictions, it's really treated more like a civil offense. But what Heather's doing might not be viewed as the typical genetic stalking because she's not following a person she knows to get information about that person. She's collecting it from somebody who's unknown. So it's almost as though Heather's collected a stack of medical records that have been redacted. She's getting all this information, potentially, and I don't think you're probing for all that information, but she has the potential in collecting the DNA to get all this information, but she doesn't know who it belongs to. So that gets to the second question about whether the lack of the identity, not knowing who this person is, makes the privacy issue different. This is where I think we come to the second privacy, the piece of privacy, which is the right to control how things about us are used. So even though we don't know the identity of this person, she could potentially, or others, could be getting information about this individual. And then there's a question, should people be able to say whether or not their information is used in certain ways? This has been a really big debate in genetics research. So for a long time, researchers have been using pathology samples to do various kinds of research. And people started to notice in the mid-90s, they said, well, wait a minute, they're doing genetic research, and shouldn't people have to give consent? And there's an ongoing debate, but the regulations for human subjects research have been interpreted to say it's okay to do research on somebody's DNA as long as it's de-identified, as long as it's not linked to a person. But there are many people, myself included, who think, well, is it really that straightforward? Because people might have an interest in saying, even if you don't know it's about me, I don't want my DNA used for this kind of research or for that kind of research. So then the question here is, do people have the same sort of interest in saying, I don't want my DNA used for this kind of art project, right? Is it the same kind of interest or not? Maybe people don't want it used because they think it's creepy, right? I don't want to be part of this, it's too sci-fi, keep my DNA out of it. The other problem is that she doesn't know who the people are, but it's sort of quasi-identifiable. She's creating likenesses of people, so maybe it's a close enough likeness that you could track it to a person and say, oh, that really looks like Sarah, I think it's that person. And then does that person want to be displayed on a wall? Does that person want to have the fact that they were at that particular location smoking a cigarette known, right, when she has all of that information? This has come up in the research context as well because DNA is uniquely identifiable. So it's always theoretically possible to figure out who a sample belongs to if you have access to a database that has DNA fingerprints or DNA identification. And if we move to an era where we have universal data banks, and that seems to be the way we're going with the police collection of information, right? First it was just people who were convicted. Now it's spreading to arrestees. We're also doing familial searching in many jurisdictions where relatives can be identified because their samples are close matches to people who are convicted, which only highlights the discriminatory effect when you have 40% of the data bank minorities, and now you can get to family members. You've just increased the disparities. So there are big concerns there. All right, so what about the fact that the samples have been abandoned? Nancy raised many, many important points about that. From the police perspective, that's not really an issue when they collect DNA from an abandoned cigarette. My favorite example is when the police did this, posed as a tort firm, and they had somebody they were concerned about, and they said, you could be involved in a class action lawsuit. Please fill out this form and mail the envelope to us. And then from the envelope that the individual had licked, they were able to analyze the DNA. Right? The person wasn't abandoning it to the police. He thought that he was giving it to a tort firm and he was going to make a lot of money in a lawsuit. So the police, the Fourth Amendment is really what controls this, and the Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures. The Supreme Court has said that your trash is fair game. It's abandoned, so that can be analyzed. The Supreme Court hasn't answered the question about whether you can then analyze DNA in the trash. But lower courts have said, not a problem. It's been abandoned. But I think Nancy's quite right. You want to separate out the gum from the DNA in the gum. And I think it really misses the mark to say that you've abandoned your DNA. So when you toss your gum out, you're not probably thinking, although Heather's work will ask us to think about this, you're not thinking, oh, I am throwing away my gum and my DNA. You're probably not intending to do that. You're also not necessarily expecting that somebody is then going to analyze the DNA in your gum. So do you have a reasonable expectation to privacy? I think at this point, people probably say, yeah, I'm not thinking that it can be done that easily. But what's tricky here, and what Heather's work highlights, is that as the technology gets easier, as the ordinary citizen can very easily get a lot of genetic information from your gum, are we going to still have that same expectation of privacy? Or are we going to just start to think, nothing's private here. I can't really expect that people aren't going to get that information. That could have implications for the Fourth Amendment. That could also have implications for what we think about our privacy with respect to private actors. So there's a tort called unreasonable intrusions, which might apply here. We might say, or maybe not with Heather's work because she's getting information about publicly identifiable traits, but if she were to probe for more hidden information, that might look like that kind of a tort. And the question there is this objectionable or offensive to a reasonable person? If Heather were trying to see if I was at increased risk of Alzheimer's, I think we might say that's offensive or objectionable. But the law also asks whether we think the technology is abnormal in character, so wiretapping is considered problematic. Right now, I think we're at a point where we would say, yes, offensive and objectionable. But if it becomes commonplace, our notions about what is appropriate, what is normal may change, just in the way that privacy tastes may be changing online with the internet. So I think this is a real place for the laws to exercise the expressive function of trying to shape what we still think should be private. So even though it becomes easier to get this information, if we have laws that do not condone access to this information, maybe that will help us maintain a reasonable sense of privacy and a reasonable expectation of privacy here. So lots of really intriguing issues, fascinating stuff.
So thank you, that was great. So what I want to start with is to see if any of the panel members want to respond to sort of what they've heard, or if Heather wants to maybe address some of the questions that Nancy and Sonia have raised before we open it up to a larger discussion.
I was actually mostly just taking notes because I thought it was so fascinating, the little nuggets that they brought out. So I would probably just pass it on.
Can I?
Yeah, absolutely.
There was one thing that actually I'm glad Nancy brought up, and I just didn't think I had enough time to get into it, but now I can add on my time. So the question of whether it's property or privacy is a sort of really interesting one. In only a handful of jurisdictions is genetic information defined as property. Although it's very hard, I wrote a piece called Disentangling Privacy from Property because it's really hard to know exactly what added work it does when you define it as property. Because I think in the end, it's all about trying to give control over your information. Property maybe opens up the door for the possibility of criminal offenses if people take it, so then you can think in theft terms if we identify it as property. And so it may have that added sort of weight in defining it in that way. But privacy sort of came out of property law, and so there's a sort of interesting connection between property and privacy law. And so I think in many of the jurisdictions that call it property, they're really trying to achieve much the same thing as the laws that define it as a privacy interest or a privacy right.
Yeah, I'm going to, as the moderator, I'm going to ask the first question, then turn it over to Eleanor. But I want to ask a general question to everyone and get to this question of should we expect to have this right of privacy in the current sort of world that we live in with sort of, social networking, but then also sort of I was thinking about what happened after the Boston bombing, where there's cameras basically everywhere and they're capturing these images and then sending those out as the FBI did and said to the community, look at these pictures and let us know if you've seen anyone or recognize any of these people. And whether that is any different than what Heather's doing as far as collecting DNA and making those same types of identifying properties to be able to identify someone. Because I think we also saw with crowdsourcing those images, I think it was the New York Post or Daily News or one of them put the wrong images up there and sort of, led people in the wrong direction. So I'd like to get your thoughts on whether we should expect to have this notion of privacy sort of separate from the law.
Yeah, so this was a big scientific debate in New York, actually, because there was, I would say, minority handful of scientists that actually believe that there's no way to keep your DNA private, and that you're leaving it all over the place. It's going to become public, and so what we as a society should be doing is focusing on protection, around discrimination, both by insurers and perhaps in the law enforcement context and that kind of thing, and other protections for the individual so that they're protected from unwanted kinds of disclosure rather than focusing on the DNA itself. And I think it really is an interesting question because as the homegrown methods that Heather is illustrating here become more and more prevalent with, the do-it-yourself movement or the makers movement. You're just going to find this. And so I think it's really important to start asking.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that. I think this has been really an ongoing debate for a long time in genetics, which is, do you protect privacy by limiting access to the biological sample or the information therein, or do you just prohibit the misuse? And in the end, what we're most concerned about is the misuse. And so, you can find people who are more on the focus on the misuse side, but then there are a lot of people who say, but if we don't have rules about access, then what good is it to just say, well, you're banned from doing this? Because once somebody has it, let's say, for example, an employer or an insurer, life insurance, if, say, we were in a jurisdiction that prohibited genetic information for that, once they have the information, how do we prove that they were misusing it. So misuse can be hard to demonstrate and hard to guard against. And so I've always sort of been of the camp that you really have to focus on the two things together. Now, it's true, it's a lot harder to protect against access to information if somebody can walk away with this and do all sorts of analysis. I don't want to know a lot of my genetic information, but somebody could find it out for me. But if we have control over that, if we have laws that prohibit the ability to do that analysis, doesn't mean people won't do it, but that's the first step. And then we have laws that also guard against the misuses. I think that's the best protection. So to your question, should we expect privacy? I think we should. I think there is a difference between making images that reflect what we show in public from probing into sort of hidden information. And I think for forensic purposes in the criminal context in the police, I think they're sort of struggling, and state legislators that are thinking about this are struggling with what kind of information should we be able to access and not. And you know, it may turn out that some of the sensitive private information has great value for police detective work, but we may not say that it's worth their getting because the privacy interests are so great. So I think a photograph on the street looks very different than looking at certain pieces of my DNA. I don't think you can lump it all together. The privacy interests are very different, I think.
I think it's worth a shot, protecting the privacy. You know, it's certainly a question that we discuss a lot in relation to things like Facebook, right? And people of my generation and older tend to think, oh, these young people are just oversharing everything and all their data is public and oh my God, what's happening? And there's a lot of concern about that loss of privacy. And I think that in many ways this is similar, and if we don't act quickly, there will be just a new generation that doesn't expect any kind of genetic privacy.
Right, that's where I think the law can play a role in shaping norms, which is, I think, what you're getting at.
And I had a few questions that kind of open to the dimension of communication with the public, and also to your experience with art, actually. So I wanted to ask you if you think the right to experiment is more protected and accepted in the art than in the science, and then also ask you to describe your relationship with the media. How did that help to actually raise some of the key questions you wanted to raise? What do you think about that kind of communication? What was lost in translation in that experience? And then we mentioned that amateur dimension of your work, and to what extent do you think that DIY forensic or DIY sequencing, to what extent that amateur dimension could actually help spur a resistance to what we can do about the data? So maybe a form of resistance, code of ethics, code of practices, but coming from the bottom up instead of top down.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll try to do each part here. So the first one was about experimentation. I do have a lot more freedom. Here's an example. At Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where I'm a PhD student, many of my colleagues who were in the social sciences or the natural sciences, you know, apply to the review board with their experiments and have to go through a really rigorous process where their experiments are questioned. And so when I began this project, even though I was working on it before I went to Rensselaer, I was going to continue it there. So I also applied to the review board, and their conclusion after reading my description of my project was that I didn't really need to worry about any of this because it wasn't science. Yep. You know, I'm not creating new knowledge here. I'm just taking things that exist and putting them together in one place. And so I think that that does give me a lot more freedom. The second question was about the media, which I could probably talk about all day. But I basically didn't know anything about the media going into this project and have had a real, I don't know, school of hard knocks maybe in learning about it. I think that, you know, given that the point of the piece was to create a dialogue, the media attention has been perfect for doing that. I think that if I had realized when I started the different ways in which the piece would be spun, I would have worked harder from the beginning to spin it myself. And I feel like that's something I'm only coming to now, is this realization that, like, I want the politics to be front and center, so I need to make it front and center as much as possible in the interviews, although it seems that even no matter what I say, the headlines end up being whatever it is that they want them to be to grab people's attention. But I do think that the media, I think tactical media intervention art has shown us that the media is a great place to spur discussion and to get people thinking about issues and perhaps to push them towards activism on those issues. And then the last question is a great one also, about resistance. I mean, I think that is potentially, this is a project that I'm still in the middle of, but when I come to a place where I feel comfortable sharing all of the resources, sharing code, sharing all of the literature that I've amassed, and working on this, it is potentially something that I can open source, and we can create a community that potentially has a deep understanding of the problematics of, for example, when this becomes commonplace in law enforcement, right? How do you challenge something that becomes commonplace? It's through a deep understanding of how the technology works. And so I think by open sourcing this information, it will enable a community of resistance. And that's something, like the question of whether to open source or not is something I've grappled with a lot. And I think my conclusion on that is that it is better to enable people to resist if they want to, than to worry about someone coming and making $1 million business out of it. I don't know. Pass on to you guys.
All right, so we have about an hour, so I want to open it up to everyone here in the audience, and to the people on the web. I'm going to figure out what's the best email address for you to be able to email questions into us. But for now, if people have some questions or comments, please raise your hand and I will get a mic to you. And just identify yourself so people in the interwebs know who you are.
Hi, my name is Russell Michael. I am a comment and a half-formed question, I'm afraid. The comment actually comes back to Todd's comment about the Boston bombings and the photographic evidence that was accumulated, but I was thinking of it instead of the issue of going out to people and saying, do you recognize any of these people? The process by which they put together all the photos they collected and basically were able to reconstruct all of the intersecting lives that moved around on that day in that place. And I was really struck by the NPR interview when they talked to the man who was going to be doing the analysis of the photos. And the interviewer said, what is the likelihood that we'll actually have an image of the bomber or bombers? And of course I thought, well, what a great question, what is the likelihood? And without missing a beat, he said, 100%, and we'll have 100 of them. Because there's so much evidence gathered that essentially what they could do is recreate the lives and paths of everybody that was there if they wanted to. And you're making me worry that actually, constrained only by resources, we're all leaving that similar kind of a trail now genetically as we go through our lives, that if somebody wants to, they can actually begin to reconstruct what actually happened here among people who had no reason to worry about their actions. The question I have is, and this is all amazingly fascinating in the legal piece, but I was struck when Youth Professor Suter first mentioned, as you look in advance of a well-defined body of statutes at the ethics of some of these things, there's some things that are less sensitive, and you use gender as an example. And I was thinking, well, for some people that may be obvious, but that's exactly the sort of thing that for other people is exactly what they want to protect. So, the fact that you're here appearing as a woman, it's much more important to me to give you the right to appear as a woman than for me to feel I have a right to know that actually you're a man. And I think that gets into an expression issue. I think Heather artistically, you want her to have the artistic right of expression, but what about Bob when he puts on his dress in the evening and goes out? What should protect his rights of how he chooses to present himself?
Well, quickly, I would say that struck me as well, because one of the things I've realized in going into this project is that a lot of information that might seem not to be sensitive turns out to be much more sensitive than you would think. So gender is definitely one of those cases. And then also I think ethnicity, can be really complicated and tied to people's identity formation, to find out that you are or are not of a certain ancestry could be really damaging as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was preparing my remarks, I was going to make a caveat for most people, right? I think for the majority of people, but of course it's the minority for whom it really matters. But almost every single genetic privacy law makes an exception in their definition of genetic information for sex. Because can you imagine, I mean, if you're not, I mean, it's just sort of hard to say. I mean, just defining what we mean by genetic information is really highly problematic, because it turns out it really, lots of things would be genetic information. So legislatures have really struggled in trying to think what's in, what's out, and they almost always exclude sex. Because they figure, for the vast majority of people, it's sort of known, it's not really sensitive and private, but you're right. If we start to probe into this, I mean, even eye color, right? I could be walking around with contact lenses. That's not sensitive maybe in the same sort of way. Or if I've had a nose job. I mean, there are lots of things that we might be hiding that our DNA would suddenly expose. So I think that's a fair point.
Hi, my name is Thea Cook. I'm from the CUSP program, Urban Studies. I have a question about biometrics. And hi.
Hi, I couldn't
I
find
have.
you.
It might be far in the reach and far in the future, but I was curious about how the evolution of biometrics came about. Like, fingerprinting used to not be a private thing, and they use it for tracking criminals, and now they have children fingerprinting and in schools and whatnot, and biometrics in school for children to even get lunch. How is this? How can what you do with the DNA typing and everything reach into biometrics and almost being mandatory, or law enforcement or whatever using it as an excuse to make it mandatory?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is making me think of something an image a friend sent to me yesterday of an ad, an HSBC ad that says, I think it said, "Your DNA is your data," and it had an image of a barcode and a fingerprint and DNA all happen, kind of conflating all these images. I think, I'm not sure if the phenotyping adds a lot to the basic question of DNA as a biometric. I mean, I think that there's little doubt that we will probably move in that direction increasingly, as DNA typing becomes easier and faster. We have these things like the ION that's supposedly coming out, this USB DNA analyzer that's supposed to be able to analyze in 24 hours for $1,000 a genome. I mean, I have some questions about that, but that's what I think is being publicized. So it is going to be happening faster and more frequently. And perhaps we can look at the history of things like fingerprinting, like looking at, well, where did the fingerprint come from, and what are some of the problems that arose from the use of fingerprinting, and how even just the fingerprint, adversely affects certain communities through things like fingerprinting for welfare recipients, stuff like that. So those are, I think, places where we could try to, again, look at the history of previous technologies that are very similar to learn about where these things are going to become major issues. But I don't know, what do you guys think about biometrics?
Well, I don't know about biometrics generally, but I thought you were also going to point of, would our DNA be available as sort of identification for everybody in the same way that we use fingerprints? And I think, I do think we're headed in that direction. I think as they talk about it as mission creep with the CODIS, the collection of databases on criminals and now arrestees. And the offenses, I think it was you, Nancy, talking about the offenses or I can't remember which one of you. So they can be pretty minor offenses. And you may not know this, but almost all of us have, or many of us have our DNA stored in a public health lab somewhere, because when we're born in the United States, newborn screening happens. And it is essentially mandatory in most jurisdictions. There's an opt-out provision in some jurisdictions. And how long these samples are kept varies, but some of them are kept indefinitely, and they've used them to identify when there's a body and they can't find somebody. They've used them for those purposes. Now, they're not supposed to be using them for all sorts of other purposes. They're supposed to be prohibitions, but there's been a lot of controversy recently because it's been discovered that they've been using these samples to do research. So parents don't even know that their children have been tested for these metabolic disorders, let alone that the samples are retained and then shared with researchers. And so, I think that as we become more comfortable with all of this, it sort of goes to Todd's point and what Heather's trying to raise. My concern is that we just become increasingly comfortable with this idea, and it just becomes the norm. It's just sort of becomes slowly, gradually acceptable as we expand to moving to. And there is an argument for a universal database, actually. The argument would be we would avoid the discriminatory effects that we have right now. If we're just basing it on people who are convicted and arrested, we do have this racial disparity. And that's the best argument for a universal database, is to say, okay, now everybody's subject to access by the police. But there are other reasons to be worried about a universal database.
Yeah, I think the use of biometric tools like your iris in your eye, right, or fingerprints, are all kind of seeking to protect either access to information that needs to be secure in some way, or providing unique markers that can identify a person in the event of some kind of catastrophe, right, like a child being snatched or lost or something like that. And DNA is kind of one step beyond that, and I think probably one step more accurate in terms of actually precisely defining someone. I am a little bit less optimistic about the time frame and cost of sequencing becoming low enough and fast enough to be able to do something like this. I don't think it's going to be in the next couple of years even you know, having had that experience at the New York Genome Center and access to all of the newest technologies, we got a ways to go. It's definitely coming, but we got a ways to go, and I don't think that I don't think it's going to be in the next year. So I think these biometric technologies are trying to take the place of what DNA sequencing could actually do.
I wonder with that, you know, if we think about the task as being just to look at like an early version of the CODIS system, right? Just like 8 locations on the genome, for example, as a limited form of identification, that could potentially happen more quickly.
That could definitely happen, right? If you're not looking for the whole genome, yeah. Just, yeah.
Other questions?
This is Dan Greshkin from GenSpace. Heather, this is a quick question for you. Can you tell us a little bit about what that conversation with 23andMe was like? And how easy or difficult is it to put someone else's DNA into that vial?
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. That conversation, it's really hard to find a way of contacting anyone high up at 23andMe. So basically, I've a few times just emailed customer support with, my original question was, can I send extracted DNA to you? And they said no. And so I tried to fight back about it a little bit because honestly, the biggest obstacle for me in working on this project has been just the enormous amount of time to analyze even one trait. And you know, a lot of, I think, the criticism of the project has been related to the fact that it is a work in progress, and I haven't analyzed all 50 traits for these found samples yet, and you know, they're not going to be that accurate. If I was able to put it in a 23andMe vial and send it off, I would have all that information within weeks. So, so I requested that I send them the pure DNA. They said no. I fought back a little and said, but don't you just extract the DNA and then run it through the machines anyway? And they still said no. And then
Did they say no because it wasn't yours?
nope, they just said no, they don't do that. They didn't care that it was someone else's DNA. They just said it didn't fit into their process of analyzing samples. Basically, it didn't fit in with their machinery, you know, the protocol that they use for. Because what they do, what I imagine from this discussion, what I imagine that they do is they just take the spit sample and then it goes through a fairly automated process, and that there isn't a lot of flexibility in that process.
Are they worried about purity?
I think, well, yeah, so let me continue here a little bit. So then I tried this again because I've been in conversations with a medical examiner in Delaware about trying to help with unidentified remains to see, you know, if there is some way, for example, the case that we're looking at, a woman has been unidentified for 20 years, and I think that there is a possibility here that genetic information can give some hints about more about what someone might look like than just what you discover from the bones, especially if the bones are, disfigured in any way. And it seems to me like this is one of actually the applications of this kind of technology, which could be really beneficial without being harmful or potentially very harmful. Would be interesting to talk about that too. So then I approached it again and said, here I have this very worthy cause. Would you consider letting me send in this purified DNA? They still said no. I tried to send them a sample anyway, but it didn't pass their purity tests. So initial attempts at sort of scamming them have been unsuccessful. But I would be curious to hear what you guys think about sort of the difference between, for example, forensic DNA phenotyping as it applies to a suspect in a criminal case versus unidentified remains from, a tragedy or just from a murder victim.
Well, I think that just raises the fact that none of these are easy questions, and that if it was all bad, it would be really straightforward. But genetic information can be used for all sorts of beneficial purposes. Even familial searching. I have issues with familial searching, but it's been really beneficial in identifying criminals. And so I think you don't have anything else. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be a photograph, but I don't have problems with that per se. Even potentially some forms of phenotyping for forensic purposes for identifying criminals might be. I tend to take a view that says you have to sort of have protections on either end. I don't think an absolutist position is really the right way to go. It's a complex world we live in, and we're always trying to balance privacy, autonomy against other social goods like solving crimes, identifying victims. There's families out there who want to know who this person is. So.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that using DNA to generate likenesses of someone who may have committed a crime is much like, just having a police sketch from eyewitnesses, except it's probably more accurate, and you're less likely to, sweep somebody up into an investigation that's not implicated. And so I think that is worthwhile. I think the question around accuracy is a really important one because there's two components to it. One is really around, do we have the information that will actually allow us to define facial characteristics, right? So you can't describe age, for example, in the analysis that you do and some other things. And so you may not get an accurate portrait of a face at all, but that's not really the issue because the art you're doing is about asking the questions, right? But the other part of the accuracy question is, are you getting high-quality sequencing and data out of your testing? And it requires, you to have a certain size DNA sample. It has to be amplified a certain number of times. You have to have certain purity in it. And it has to be run the right way. That sample has to be processed in a standardized way in order to be able to compare it. And if it's not, then you got a problem because you're not really getting valid genetic data out of that process. And so then what does your end result tell you, if anything? And actually, on the direct-to-consumer companies, this became a real issue about 3 or 4 years ago with 23andMe and Navigenics, and there was one other company that I forget now, where they were promising to provide consumers with the same type of genetic information, but all of their processes were different, and the end result was all different too. So consumers, submitted samples to each of the different companies and got back different information. And so what do you do with that, right? Who's right about that? And so there's a lot of questions. These technologies are still emerging, and the way that they're being utilized is still hard. And I actually, if you are in New York State, right? I would really encourage you to look at the regulations in New York because I think some of them might be problematic.
Well, that's interesting also, because there's really no way that we as individuals even know what a lot of the laws are.
Right.
I mean, like you say, look into the regulations. It makes me think, I wonder how I do that.
Well, my question, New York does have one of the more comprehensive privacy laws. The one thing I didn't have a chance to look, was how it defined what information you can't get. So New Jersey is problematic for you. I did have the definition there, but some of the states, like you could do this in Nevada or Georgia, even though they have privacy protections, because they define genetic information as information about predisposition to disease. That's not what you're looking at.
Right.
But if New York defines it broadly to include traits, then you have problems. So I will look that up for you and email you.
Thanks.
Actually, I wasn't thinking about it from a privacy perspective. New York has a very complex regulatory structure for sequencing DNA samples. So first of all, you can't sequence unless it's prescribed by a doctor in New York. And secondly, it has to be done by a company who has been licensed to do that particular type of sequencing for a particular type of interpretation. It has to be approved by the state, and nobody has that license yet. So if you're not approved, you can't do it. So 23andMe was going to have a big spit party, in Manhattan to kick off their Manhattan presence, and it turns out that everybody had to go out of state and spit so that they could collect the samples of the people who lived in Manhattan.
I had to do that
Yeah.
when I did mine.
Can I follow up on that legal question, Sony, that you brought up about? Now, does it matter that she's collecting these from people she doesn't know? So does the person whose DNA that she was collected is that the person that actually has to, in a sense,
Consent.
file the suit or whatever it is that would trigger that law?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it couldn't be like if you find this offensive work, you have to have standing. So you have to be the injured party. It has to be some injury that's befallen you. So as long as they're not good likenesses, then she's okay. But
We're
if
a
it really
long way off.
but it could be close enough that somebody says, "Hey, that looks like me," and I don't know. Do you have any more of the information that you could track? Would that
So-
person be able to show it was them?
Yeah, here's the status of that. Actually, people do email me and say, that portrait looks like me. That's so cool. Can I send you my DNA? Most of the emails I get are from people who want to send me their genetic material, which is interesting. But, right now, these portraits are so far in progress. I mean, they're not even, even if I had the whole 23andMe profile, the likeness I created would probably look like a family resemblance or like a general, likeness, but it still wouldn't look just like you. Even with all of the information, it's still not going to look just like you. Even in the future when, let's say we bring in the epigenetic information, then maybe we get age in there. Maybe we start to get some other things, in there as well. But it still isn't going to be such an exact reconstruction of the face that you'd walk in and say, oh my God. And I wish I forgot to include my self-portrait in this slideshow, but the self-portrait that I made, which you can find if you Google my name, you will see that there's a number of things that we have in common, me and the genetic self-portrait, but there's a lot of differences also. So I think it's incredibly, incredibly unlikely anyone at any point in the near future would walk into a gallery and say, hey, that's me. The only scenario I've been able to envision here would be if, for example, I took one of these and I sequenced it much more fully. Let's say I do either like a DNA fingerprinting thing and then somehow get access to a CODIS database, or let's say I do a full genome sequence and then start searching online and start searching to see if it matches with anyone whose DNA might happen to be online for whatever reason. Then I can potentially find a match.
Do you keep the DNA? Do you have any left over that somebody could come in and say, I think that looks like me, let me give you my sample and let's compare?
There's still a little, so for this guy, I still have, a couple microliters of DNA. I don't get a lot. Right. Even just doing the forensic extraction, it leaves you with just like 40 microliters, and then each experiment takes 2.5. So it's a limited run that I have there, given my resources right now.
I also just want to emphasize something that Sonia said earlier, which is it's not genetics alone that determine what you look like. So identical twins have exactly the same DNA, but by the time they're adults, they may look very, very different because of their environment and environmental factors that play into what you look like. And so that's a big part of it.
It's been said that samples have been... Oh, sorry. Yeah, Larry Altman, fellow here. It's been said that samples have been collected on political candidates during campaigns. Now, it's all been said, but do we know anything, do we have any documented evidence that the samples were used in genetic or genomic testing was done?
Yeah, I've only heard those reports too, and also that samples were collected supposedly, although it hasn't been confirmed, on Prince Harry to see if he was really Prince Charles, the son of Prince Charles. So there's a lot of rumors about that. Supposedly Britney Spears, when she got shaved all her hair off, that her hair samples went for an awful lot of money. But how much analysis there actually was, I don't know. There was a website that was offering, and it doesn't exist anymore, and forget what it was called, but you could send information, you could send samples supposedly and get information on celebrities. And one of my colleagues called it, instead of the paparazzi, the Ginarazzi. You're trying to get all their information. That's Mark Rothstein. It was a clever term. So I don't know how much was really done with that. I think it's more just sort of urban myth than reality, because I suspect if a lot more had been done, we'd know about it, or there wasn't enough good information to share.
I wonder what service they used.
Maybe or maybe not. I mean, they may have done a complete analysis and they just didn't find something that would suit their purpose, so
Possible.
outsiders wouldn't know.
Right.
I mean, you can conjecture all you want.
That's true. I think there's also, though, a lot of misunderstanding about what types of things we can get DNA from easily. Like, if Britney Spears, cuts her hair like this, that hair isn't going to have the follicle. And like all of the DNA that I get from hair is from that little bit that touches your head. So if you don't have the follicle, it's extremely hard to get anything beyond mitochondrial DNA, which would hint at maternal ancestry. So unless you're questioning someone's maternal ancestry, just cut hair from a barbershop is not a good source of genetic information.
More questions?
Quick question about research. Who's actually out there researching the correlations between your facial structure and your looks and your DNA? Are there labs, academic labs or private labs, or doing that research?
Yeah, so there's probably a number of different ways that this is being researched. The ones that I've come across, so there are scientists sort of scattered around the world who are looking at facial morphology, right? So the way that our face is formed and how our faces differ from each other based on genome-wide association studies. So looking at lots and lots and lots of genomes and correlations between them, and then correlating those with facial features. So we have a little bit of preliminary information from that, and oftentimes the association of a facial feature is related to some kind of abnormal gene that we already know, like this codes for some problem with the structure of the face. So I would say that research is still really in its early stages, and I don't know if it's just because there's not a lot of funding for it or what, but there's not a lot of information that I found on, there's 5 facial feature single nucleotide polymorphisms that are, really only authenticated in European populations. That's the extent of what I've found on that angle. But there's a different approach, which I think is probably the approach that's going to end up being successful. This is an approach that Mark Shriver is taking. He's at Penn State, and he is basically 3D scanning people's faces and collecting 23andMe kits and finding the correlations himself. So that, I think, is potentially, that's kind of the statistical approach, that's the machine learning approach, that's saying, let's take a bunch of data, throw it together, and just see what we find. And so I think the more he builds up these data sets, the closer he actually has, I think, a better chance of really approximating someone's likeness through that approach.
Oh, sure.
Well, you partially answered that question for me, but as an artist, my name is Nana Bhaktavatsa. I do portraiture, and I also painted DNAs. I'm interested in this cross nexus of science and art. For me, it is matter how I would have been very interested to see your self-portrait, but have you to see how accurate it is. For me, it's extremely important. Although, of course, this is not the only purpose of your project, but at the end, it matters. Have you done somebody else's that you know portrait based on DNA material? Let's say you have done it all correctly, scientifically, and and how close is the likeness? To me, it's very important, and I have, as an artist, I have that question.
No, I know, and this is really, I mean, it's the most common question I get. It's definitely not exact. It's approximate. Sometimes it's pretty far off. Like if there's some feature someone has, like maybe they have a really skinny jaw. Like if a guy has a really skinny jaw, I have no way of knowing that. So I've done a handful of different portraits based on 23andMe profiles. So I did my self-portrait. I did 2 people who had open sourced their genomes on GitHub, and I did a reporter in New York City. And there's a likeness between all of them, I think, and the person. But yeah, if you, all of this stuff is on my blog, which is...
You're connected.
Sure, yeah. So actually, I never got on the internet here.
It's all open, so you don't need a password. It just should be WWICS.
Yeah, let's see.
And maybe while you're pulling that up, I'll ask another question, but maybe more towards Nancy and Sonia. So if we I have this question that you guys raised about this right to know and your right not to know sort of information from your DNA. Is there any sort of ethics, or I'm trying to think of the word, but from Heather's standpoint, if she had a lot more information, is there any obligation that she has to let you know something that she found if it was, say, a serious medical condition? And how does the law sort of deal with that? Is also your right not to know, but if she knows it, does she have to tell you?
Well, do you want to go ahead? It's interesting you should raise this because this is a really big issue right now in genetics, both in research and in clinical care, which is the incidental finding. So as we move towards whole genome sequencing or other kinds of microarray analysis where we're able to get lots of different information, you may be looking for one thing and then suddenly discover that somebody is at an increased risk for something else. So the research community's really struggled with the question of, do we have an obligation as a researcher to share this information with people who are just research subjects? And I think the consensus is moving toward the view that says people who participate in research should know about this possibility and should be able to express whether they want to get this information. And if it is clinically actionable, in other words, it's valid, we know it really means something, and there's something that can be done, then that should be shared with them. Now, this is not the law. This is just sort of research ethics. Recently, just like a week or two ago, there was a paper that came out in Science by a bunch of researchers that said in the clinical context, whole genome sequencing, even if you're looking for something completely different, should look for these 57 diseases. The lab should test for these 57 mutations or variations, should report them, and physicians should disclose them to the patient whether or not the patient wants that information. There's a response piece that came back and said, no, what about patient autonomy? And I, as a genetic counselor, sort of have the view that people should be able to know up front what the possible information is and should be able to say yes or no. Heather, I think, is not in a position under the law where she has any obligation. That sort of would come down to tort law. Do you have an obligation? I think a physician would be worried in not disclosing because they could be sued if there was something that could be done. They could be sued if the patient hadn't If the patient had never said, I don't want to know this, then it would be sort of a breach of the duty of care. But these are strangers. Well, of course, how could she notify them? But if she knew the person, Heather doesn't have a legal obligation to care for these individuals. And so I think it would be hard to say that she has a legal obligation. And then it would also get into the question of right not to know. So would she say to the person, would you like to know if I happened to find out that you're at risk for Alzheimer's? You'd want to ask those questions up front, I suppose. And then, then depending on whether if there was sort of an understanding, perhaps there might be an obligation if she was really talking to a person. But it looks very different than I think the doctor-patient relationship.
Yeah, so in addition to what Sonia's already said, a lot of whether that information can be shared with you depends on the type of consent you've signed. So if it's very narrow in terms of, I'm giving you the authority to test my genetic information for this type of information, then if they find something else, they can't tell you, actually. And a lot of people don't want to know. I mean, for myself, I'm always been relatively healthy. I lead a healthy lifestyle. If there's something I'm going to get in 20 years that I really can't avoid, I don't want to know about it, frankly. If I was sick and had cancer, then I would definitely want my cancer sequenced, because then it would determine the type of treatment that I would seek, and it would help me. But just having my genome sequenced right now, since there's really no family history of genetic issues, and I'm healthy, I don't see any reason for it. And I wouldn't want a physician to force that information on me. I also think that there's a broader issue in terms of medical discovery, because you can't find the patterns, genetic patterns necessary to discover and develop new drugs unless you can share information across patients about genetic variation. And so in order to do that, you need broad consent forms that patients give that, you can actually use their genetic information. And there are databases now that are being constructed where these tests come through, and there might not be enough information to label that genetic variation pathogenic or actionable, which is what they call it. But it could be of interest. But over time, as both the medical history and the genetic information for that particular biomarker increases, then you are going to move from one category to another, of interest to actionable. And that's the only way to really understand. And so to do it, you need broad consent. And that, that's another thing. Then if you have that broad consent, how long does the doctor have in a reporting responsibility back to that patient, right? For information that maybe 5 years later comes out from some other physician using it for a new test. So those are all kinds of questions that are being struggled with right now.
And then to follow up on that, I think that this is really such a tricky area in so many respects. So you're right that a lot of the laws say you only test for what the patient has consented to, but the informed consent process in clinical care is going to become a nightmare because of the huge amount of information that people can possibly get. So what are people going to actually be consenting to? How are they going to understand the nature of information? We're likely going to have to be talking to patients in very broad categories about, these are the different kinds of pieces of information we could get. Do you want this category? Do you want that category? Because it's just, it could take 5 to 6 hours to disclose everything that you might be able to find out. And people can't really process that information, and our healthcare systems surely can't afford it either.
So this is the self-portrait. Unfortunately, the projector is not, the color representation is not fantastic on this projection. But I think anyway, what you can see is that we have certain things in common. If you were to look at that portrait and then look around the room and try to pick out who the portrait connected to, chances are good you would pick me, but not because it looks just like me, because we have things in common, right? Because we're of Northern European descent, have blue eyes, have freckles, which you can't see on the projector, but you probably can't see them on my face either. So, you know, there's these certain characteristics that we have in common, and you could narrow them down, you know, if you're thinking about the application in law enforcement, for example. And there is that likeness, but it doesn't look like me. You know, when we think about what our friends look like or our family looks like, we think about something very precise. And so I would say it doesn't look like me, but we have a lot of things in common. Yeah.
I was just wondering in terms of any liability for your use of an individual's DNA, would some of that be mitigated by randomly exchanging some of your data points among the DNA samples you have, and would that undermine the integrity of what you're trying to do, do you think? If it wasn't, that's not all Bob, but that is a person from real samples.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you think that would change the legal?
But, I mean, it depends how the laws are written. They're also different. But if it says that you cannot do genetic analysis without a person's consent, then it doesn't matter what she does with it in the end. And so I think in those jurisdictions it would be a problem. Yeah.
But that, I think, points up another important question about the accuracy of the results, right? Because what if two people smoke that cigarette, right?
Yeah. It's a good way of masking your
so
DNA,
you've got a
actually.
mixture of DNA, and it's not just one person.
Right. Yeah, I have no way of knowing that.
Right.
Definitely. I mean, I know if I had some more, some fancier processes, I'd have a much better chance of figuring out whether something had multiple sources. But certainly for me, it very well may be that, and I think that those are good techniques for masking your DNA if you're interested in privacy.
Share that gum with somebody else.
Exactly. Pass
But
the
also
water
think
glass
about
around.
it from a accuracy point of view in terms of processing the tests, right? So there are many instances where lab results have been falsified in the criminal area with really bad consequences, right? So if people just switch somebody's DNA and the wrong person got implicated, that had catastrophic consequences for that individual. So that's where some of the key questions come in.
But then, of course, to go to both the good and the bad of DNA, DNA has also been used to exonerate people, right? So I mean, it's like it's a dual-edged sword. It really is.
You expressed some skepticism about the $1,000 genome analysis being done, and saying it's coming, but how valid was the contention that it would be done for $1,000? Was it just as a way of shocking people into thinking that could be done, or was it just good PR on the part of the company that was developing it, or how realistic is it?
Well, the $1,000 genome has always been like the holy grail, right? So in 2003, we had one genome sequence for $3 billion. And now you can do it in about 2 weeks for about $3,600. And the newer machines that are much more productive, actually, if you run them, they can do it in 24 hours, but the reagents needed to run them are much higher than $1,000. So the ion proton and the ion torrent, which is based on a new kind of technology, semiconductor technology, is manufactured by a company called Life Technologies, and they have made these, statements about its productivity and accuracy, which have yet to be conclusively demonstrated.
Hi, I'm Jane O'Brien, BBC News. We've heard a lot about right to privacy, but can you, Sonia and Nancy, actually see a time where it might be a matter of compelling someone to release their DNA? You mentioned Ronald Reagan, for instance. Already presidential candidates are subjected to physical examinations. They have to release their tax returns, which many people would say are even more intrusive. Can you see a time where they will have to release their DNA sequencing?
No, I mean, I think it's a good point that although they don't have to I mean, they have a medical examination. Not everything is necessarily disclosed. I mean, I think it's complicated because of the fact that there's a lot of information that the person might not be able to do anything about. So, but I don't know if we're going to always hold on. I mean, that's sort of my genetic counseling world where we think information can be toxic. But I think increasingly people want to get as much information as they can. And I'm always sort of amazed at how people are sort of willing. I'm kind of with Nancy. I wouldn't send my sample off probably to 23andMe, but there may be evolving norms. I don't know for president, but certainly we, as I said earlier, we compel genetic testing of a sort for newborn screening. And I think it's a matter of time before that becomes whole genome sequencing. Oh, making it public. Okay. Making it public. That's I think only if you could say that there was something of national interest. I mean, you're facing that challenge all the time. If there's something that would endanger the country in some way, it was really important information to know, perhaps. But I think public, that's so you're not just compelling the testing, but actually the disclosure. It's hard for me to imagine that we move quite that far with genetic information. But, you know, I think that part of the question is how much are our norms evolving, so.
To follow up, could you see that from a medical reason, whereas the more genetic information you have, the sort of further along we could get for certain cures for genetic diseases, that would be an impetus to force that information to become public in a sense?
Let me just comment on the last question first. I think we have to be really careful about genetic determinism in this instance when you're talking about forcing someone to disclose their genetic information because you think it's going to have some kind of effect on the national security or some, and I'll just use that hypothetical example of Ronald Reagan, right? So if that had happened, he had been compelled to disclose that he had a tendency towards Alzheimer's disease at his age of being elected president of the United States, it probably would have had a serious effect on what had happened in that election. And look what happened in his administration in terms of the end of the Cold War and all of the changes in the Soviet Union that were brought about, not to even to begin to talk about changes in our own country as a result of supply-side economics and other things. And all of that resulted in spite of the fact that he had a tendency towards Alzheimer's. So I think we have to be really careful about genetic determinism and drawing that direct link between this information is causative of what comes next, because it's not necessarily so.
That is an important point. I mean, there's very few neurological disorders that are, I mean, Huntington's, if you have the gene and you live long enough and you're not hit by a car, we know that you're going to develop it, but there are really very few that fit into that model, and it's much more where we're talking about probabilities, predisposition. So your question was our concern, our desire to find cures, should that compel disclosure?
Yeah,
of
so
genetic
I'm
information?
basing this sort of like the personal genome project. So my understanding is that in order to sort of do a lot of these sort of genetic comparisons, particularly for sort of health screenings and to develop sort of cures for diseases, that you really need to have the DNA sequence connected to an actual person.
Right.
So you can go back and forth. And so if the societal benefit would be, say, a cure for, say, breast cancer or whatever, is that a compelling argument to say, in order for the larger healthcare system, that we sort of would in a sense force people to give their genetic information up for this benefit of the
For that
society in
benefit.
general?
I don't think we would go that far to force people to give it and make it public, but I do think that that's part of what the debate is right now about what kind of consent requirements should be imposed, particularly because it's possible to de-identify the information. I think this is the broad consent that Nancy talked about, is this idea that we need to encourage people to participate in research, and we can't just have them give samples and not know who they are. We need the clinical information as well, so we can match things up. And so that actually argues for strong privacy protections, because if we don't sort of ensure that researchers are using it only for these purposes and aren't broadly sharing this information, then nobody's going to participate. So I don't think we're at a point where we're going to compel people to do this, but it means we need to have the right kinds of safeguards to avoid misuses so that researchers have people who are participating, and so that people will see the value, because there is a real benefit in people participating in research. But I don't think it would lead to public disclosure of their information. I'm not sure that that serves a purpose. Researchers need it, but the whole world doesn't have to.
I think there's an interesting analogy. I don't know anything about the law in this area, other than there was a movie a while back. I think it was called My Sister's Keeper or something like that, where a child had a deadly disease, and they, what was it, blood or an organ or something, autoimmune condition. And so they had another child because they needed, tissue or something from that child in order to help the sister. And that new child brought the parents to court to prevent them from intruding into her body to find a remedy for her sister's illness. And her sister died. And it was a very difficult movie to watch, but the court did not compel her to produce that kind of material to save her sister's life. And I think, those kinds of legal analogies could be drawn to the question that you're talking about.
I just wanted to follow up, return to your question for just a minute, because I was sort of meditating on it as you were speaking. And what I can imagine happening is a time in the not too distant future where there's a voluntary compulsion, where people want to know, do you have an elevated risk of Alzheimer's? And are you running for president at an advanced age? Maybe the hesitancy to offer that information to the public will be seen as condemning. And that, I think, is perhaps more likely than that we'll mandate it. And I think a lot of people would really want that information. Even though it's not a determination, and I'm the first person to, speak against genetic determinism. The president is a really important person. And, we've had situations like with FDR, right? Someone gets elected and then dies immediately and hasn't necessarily put a lot of consideration into who the vice president is going to be. So maybe at least you could imagine that more consideration, not to slam anyone who's been president or anything. This is just something that was, on the news over Memorial Day. And, I think it could make us more considerate of our own mortality also, and put a lot of thought into how those choices are made potentially.
I just think, just using the example that you're talking about, Roosevelt and Truman are considered two of our greatest presidents, right? And both of them had serious handicaps. So Roosevelt was crippled, and Truman was the last president with a high school education. He really wasn't educated, right?
Yeah.
And he didn't have a lot of experience coming to the executive office. I mean, he was a bankrupt haberdasher, whatever. And so I really am worried about placing so much emphasis on genetic information as opposed to the spirit of history and of the world and of all of the events that are moving forward together to shape history as being much more important than just genetic information.
Couldn't the same argument be used for a physical examination, because there was a lot of concern about the state of John McCain's heart? To my knowledge, he's still going strong. What difference is there when we're trying to assess the value of DNA against the value of all the other information that we already have? Again, with this question to the right to privacy, what's in the public interest? What should be public knowledge?
Well, maybe the distinction is between a condition you already have and a predisposition, right? Well, age is a predisposition, but John McCain had a heart problem, right? So that, it seems to me, is something the public has a right to know going in. But if you're predisposed and you don't know if you're ever going to contract the disease, that's something different. It's a probability.
Although I think you do raise a really interesting point about that definitional issue about genetic information versus other medical information. High blood pressure is probabilistic too. You may or may not have a stroke. You may or may not have a heart attack. So, when we've tried to segregate out genetic information from other medical information, it always is lacking. It's either too under-inclusive, and it doesn't include a lot of things like family history often doesn't get included. That's pretty important genetic information. Because genes and environment work together so intricately. So you're not really only in just the genetic side or only in the non-genetic side. And so you have a point there about, is it really so different? But I think there are interpretations about it. I think people read it a certain way, and I think that's one of the things Nancy's pointed out, is that people may sort of see this as, oh, well, now he's definitely going to have a heart attack. And we might not view it the same way when we say, so there's an art to diagnosis, and people don't see that as sort of so pure and so predictive as genetic information is often understood.
The issue was not having a heart condition. The issue was that he had a melanoma and he had an extensive surgery, and the full information, there was the debate as to whether the full information was ever given. So it was about a pre-existing condition, and it wasn't on his heart because he had climbed down and gone across the Grand Canyon and a number of other things. That wasn't an issue. His age was an issue, but as a comment. But I was going to say, in terms of picking on the president, it's not picking on the president. Where down the line do you stop? Because you have the vice president, and if you stop there, well, what about the Speaker of the House and anybody who's in line for succession? So should it be any senator? Should it be any House of Representative? And do you go down to the dog catcher or whoever you consider at the low rung?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's Gattaca.
Right.
All right, well, one last question.
Is there any policy or legislation or law, having had your experiences, that you would advocate? Especially, Heather, and all of you have had such different experiences. It'd be interesting to hear what you would advocate, what you'd want to see happen in the near term or middle term.
I would actually prefer to hear from you ladies first, because I have the least experience with even knowing really what is possible to legislate. One of the questions that comes up for me here is, I think a lot of my concerns are around the use in law enforcement, and it's unclear to me, for example, should the United States pass some regulation like the Netherlands did, so that we formalize this technology can only be used for this, and this. I don't know how likely it is that things like that pass in the United States. I'm not an expert.
Well, they're contentious. There's actually a law or a bill that's being debated in California to prohibit surreptitious sampling. And it's actually getting a lot of pushback from researchers and clinicians, even though there are exceptions to allow for their uses of DNA, because they're worried that it's overkill and it's going to prohibit them from doing that. It really depends on the state. I think that there is increasingly a taste for some kind of genetic privacy protection, but researchers are strong advocates and they're worried about limiting their access to it. The kind of law I'd like to see is I would like to see stronger genetic privacy laws. I would like to restrict people's access to my DNA. I would like to have to consent to somebody doing really any kind of analysis, because I think the line drawing is so difficult. If I were trying to say, oh, you can't analyze sensitive information, but you can analyze other information, I don't know that we can draw a perfect line there. So I would prefer not to have random people analyzing my DNA. I would like to be able to consent to that, because I don't want that information out there. And also, it would affect Heather. I'm sorry. Yeah.
It's okay. That's the idea of the piece, is to raise these questions, and provoke.
As I said, what she's doing right now isn't so problematic to me, but how do I stop her? And if she really wanted to describe me fully, would a visual image of me be enough? There should be other information. So line drawing is often difficult. And then, of course, I would want to prohibit misuses as well. So I'm, sort of belts and suspenders. Don't let people get it, and don't let them do bad things with it.
Yeah, I'm kind of consistent with that. I think that, the law that was passed by the UK is probably a direction we should head in this area, because having a third party sequence someone else's DNA for their own use. It could be blackmail, it could be anything, you know, and it's just really problematic. And so I think we need to draw the line. And then, as Sonia said, I think we need to put in protections around privacy. You know, there are trade-offs between the public interest and individual privacy. You have to figure out what are the ones that are acceptable, what are the protections that we need to put in to make sure that the individual is protected. And I think we need a close look at that.
And then I just add, if I could have my wish list of everything, I would put restrictions in for what the police can do. Right now, in most jurisdictions, it's pretty unregulated. I mean, they're focusing primarily on DNA identification. There are, in some jurisdictions, sort of vague language about research purposes or criminal forensic purposes. Well, this could fall into that kind of research. So I would want clearer restrictions on what the government can do with the DNA as well. I mean, in some ways, I'm more concerned about that. I have been more concerned about that because they have the tools, but as private citizens can get the tools, then that becomes a problematic area too.
I think what that makes me wonder if there were any particular groups, advocacy groups or nonprofits who are pushing for laws in this area. If we know if there's anything that's sort of up for discussion now that might relate.
The ACLU's been pretty active in sort of these debates, and there are a lot of different groups that have been pushing. I mean, this kind of legislation's been debated for years in jurisdictions. And I think, but although on the forensic side, I think probably the push has been to expand. As I said, the mission creep is sort of, people were a little bit more restrictive in the opening up the door to more and more. So I think privacy doesn't get the same kind of weight as getting rapists off the street. In fact, I spoke at a conference about familial searching at the FBI, and I was trying, I thought, to give a balanced perspective. It has some value here. I'm not saying it should be banned entirely, but there should be restrictions. And there were people who sort of responded to my comments and the ACLU's comments as if, you don't care if rapists get on the street, you know? So I think when you see that you can solve a crime, it's very powerful, and people don't want to limit it. And my students sometimes say, look, if I'm not committing any crimes, why does it matter if the government has my DNA? But I think if we take that view and privacy sort of gets ignored altogether, we lose some really important values in our society, and it changes the culture that we live in important ways.
And we want to make sure that we don't take the wrong person off the street too, which is something I think, you know, if we sort of say, oh, don't worry too much if it's like 100% accurate, you know, then we run the risk of pointing our finger at the wrong person.
And
I mean, no one wants that.
And as Nancy points out, the DNA the identification might be fairly accurate, quite accurate, but if you get the wrong sample, it doesn't do you any good. So you still need to be careful in all the other ways.
I think one of the dangers in just who cares if the government has my DNA, you know, is, you know, it's fine as long as you've got an open democratic society that's working as it should, right? But if it's Hitler's Germany or the McCarthy era, where you're targeting specific groups for information, then you got a problem when all of this DNA is stored up in government databases. So that's one reason to protect the privacy.
And if you are someone who, you know, I mean, when I think about privacy, I think of a few groups. I think of activists, I think of criminals, and then I also think of everyone who does anything that's considered potentially deviant by the current norms of our society. Doesn't mean we're going to have the same norms 10 years from now, right? But if we start looking at things like homosexuality, and people are always looking for genes related to things like this, you know, then also there's this potentially kind of hidden information that could be used against you.
All right, well, I'd like to thank, we're at 5 o'clock, so I want to thank our panelists. This has been a fascinating discussion, so help me thank our three speakers here.